The internet did what it does to every industry it touches. It disaggregated it, democratized some of its elements, concentrated power in others, moved it partially out of the physical world, and created new forms of harm alongside new forms of freedom. For commercial sex, the digital transformation has meant safer independent work for some people with internet access and social capital, catastrophic disruption of street-level safety networks through FOSTA-SESTA, enormous new wealth for platforms that were simultaneously denying and benefiting from sexual content, and a genuinely new debate about whether any of the old policy frameworks make sense in a world where commercial sex can happen through a smartphone screen. Well, in this episode, we will examine all of that. This is episode 9 of our series, A History of Sex as a Business, brought to you by English Plus with Danny podcast. What happens when an industry that has been managed through physical geography for 5,000 years suddenly loses its geography? When a brothel is a website, a street is an app, and the transaction can happen across continents. This is the question that the digital transformation posed to every institution that had ever tried to regulate, control, benefit from, or protect people in commercial sex. Law enforcement, public health systems, anti-trafficking organization, feminist activists, civil liberties lawyers, and the people in the industry themselves. And the honest answer, which will be familiar to anyone who has watched the internet transform any other industry, is this: nobody has figured it out yet. We are now in the present, or close enough to it that the debates are live and the consequences are immediate. Everything we've built in the previous 9 episodes, the entire history of how societies have tried to manage the business of sex, is now being run through the solvent of digital technology. Some things are dissolving. Some things are proving remarkably resistant to dissolution. And some entirely new problems are being created that have no historical precedent. Now let's start by talking about before FOSTA-SESTA, the internet's Wild West period. Before we discuss the legislation that changed everything, it's worth understanding what the landscape looked like before. From roughly the mid-1990s through 2018, the internet created something genuinely new in the history of commercial sex: the ability for individuals to advertise and screen clients independently without the need for a third-party organizer. Online classified sites, Craigslist's adult services section, Backpage, and a range of international equivalent platforms allowed people working in commercial sex to post advertisements, communicate with potential clients before meeting them, screen clients by requiring advanced information or references, and share safely information with each other in online forums and networks. From a safety and harm reduction perspective, this was a significant improvement over the street-level alternative for the people using it effectively. Research consistently found that people working independently through online advertising experienced lower rates of violence than people working on the street. The ability to pre-screen clients, to communicate in advance of meeting, to share warnings about violent or exploitative individuals through peer networks, these were real protections that the digital environment enabled. Trafficking networks also use these platforms. This is not in question. The same technology that enabled independent workers to advertise safely also enabled traffickers to advertise for the people they controlled. Backpage, in particular, became the subject of sustained law enforcement and advocacy attention for its facilitation of trafficking advertisements, ultimately leading to its founders facing federal criminal charges and its seizure in 2018. The policy challenge, and this is genuinely difficult, is that the same platform feature that protects an independent worker also enables a trafficker. The ability to post an anonymous advertisement doesn't know who is posting it. Regulating the platform to reduce trafficking also reduces protection for independent workers. This is a real trade-off, not a rhetorical one. And that brings me to the FOSTA-SESTA, the law that made things worse. In April 2018, the United States Congress passed FOSTA-SESTA. the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act and the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. The legislation modified Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which had historically provided broad immunity to online platforms for the content their users posted, to remove that immunity for cases involving sex trafficking. It made platforms legally liable for content that facilitated sex trafficking without clearly defining what that meant, and criminalized the use of a computer to promote or facilitate prostitution. The legislation was supported by a broad coalition: anti-trafficking organizations, conservative religious groups, feminist activists who opposed commercial sex, and major tech companies who calculated that the public relations benefit of appearing to fight trafficking outweighed the legal risk of the legislation. It was opposed by civil liberties organizations, sex workers' rights advocates, harm reduction advocates, and many researchers who predicted that it would harm vulnerable people while doing little to address actual trafficking. The predictions of the opposition proved accurate. Within days of FOSTA-SESTA passing, the online platforms that had provided safety infrastructure for people in the industry shut down their adult services sections, not because they were caught trafficking, but because the legal ambiguity of the new law made the risk of keeping these sections open too great. Backpage was seized, Craigslist removed its personal section, a cascade of smaller platforms disappeared. The online safety networks that sex workers had built over 2 decades, the client screening systems, the safety information forums, the peer networks, were disrupted or destroyed. The people who had been working safely through online platforms did not stop working. They moved back to the street or to less regulated platforms with less safety infrastructure, or to situations of greater dependency on third parties who could provide what the online platforms no longer could. Research conducted in the years following FOSTA-SESTA found increases in violence against sex workers in multiple American cities. Studies found that the legislation had not produced a measurable reduction in trafficking. The law had made vulnerable people less safe without meaningfully addressing the exploitation it claimed to target. Survivors of trafficking themselves were split on the legislation. Some felt it was a necessary intervention. Others felt it had destroyed tools they depended on for safety. This split is itself instructive. The category sex trafficking survivor is not a politically uniform group with unified interests, and legislation that treats it as one tends to serve the most politically visible voices within it rather than the most structurally vulnerable ones. And now let's talk about OnlyFans and the creator economy. If FOSTA-SESTA represents the failure mode of internet-era commercial sex policy, OnlyFans represents something more ambiguous and more interesting. OnlyFans, a subscription content platform founded in 2016, became genuinely significant in the commercial sex ecosystem during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, when the combination of economic disruption, lockdowns, and increased screen time created both supply and demand. The platform allows creators to charge subscribers for access to content, including sexually explicit content, with the platform taking a 20% commission. What OnlyFans represented for many people who used it was something genuinely different from previous commercial sex economics. It represented direct creator-to-consumer relationships, content that the creator controlled and owned, income that went primarily to the creator rather than to a third-party organizer, and the ability to work from home without physical contact. For people with existing social capital, social media followers, online presence, marketing skills, and access to technology, it offered a degree of economic independence that had been largely unavailable in the previous commercial sex economy. But it also reproduced some of the oldest dynamics in the industry in new forms. The platform's income distribution is highly unequal. A small number of top creators earn substantial income while the majority earn very little. The demographic profile of top earners reflects existing social advantages. social media presence, physical characteristics privileged by mainstream culture, marketing skills, access to quality equipment. The platform economy's winner-take-most dynamics apply to this market as they apply to every other. The people who needed economic alternatives most urgently, people with the fewest existing social advantages, benefited least from the platform. In August 2021, OnlyFans announced it would ban sexually explicit content, citing pressure from its banking partners and payment processors, and then reversed that decision within a week, citing the opposition of its creator community. The episode revealed something important. The financial infrastructure of the internet economy, we're talking about banks, payment processors, and hosting companies, exercises enormous de facto regulatory power over online commercial sex through its policies and risk aversion, operating without the accountability or transparency of formal legislation. And now let's talk about the technology companies and their complicated role. Now, the major technology companies occupy a deeply uncomfortable position in the landscape of commercial sex in the digital age. On one hand, platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter have explicit policies against sexually explicit content and against content that facilitates commercial sex. These policies are enforced through content moderation systems that are inconsistent, often opaque, and that sex workers consistently report apply more harshly to them than to other users. On the other hand, the same companies generate significant advertising and engagement revenue from sexual content in various forms. Content that rides up to the line of their explicit policies and sometimes over it, and that drives substantial user engagement. The platform's financial interest in engagement and the platform's stated content policies are in tension, and the tension is resolved differently depending on who the user is, how many followers they have, and how much advertising revenue they represent. Payment processors like Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal have increasingly become de facto content regulators through their decisions about which businesses and individuals they will process payments for. When MasterCard and Visa cut off service to OnlyFans in 2021, it was this threat that prompted the attempted content ban. These companies exercise enormous power over the internet economy's commercial sex sector without any formal regulatory mandate and without any of the accountability that formal regulation requires. This is a structural problem that goes beyond commercial sex. The privatization of regulatory power in the hands of financial infrastructure creates an unaccountable system that operates with neither the constraints of government regulation nor the market discipline of competitive pressure. When these companies decide that commercial sex is too legally or reputationally risky to process, the consequences fall most heavily on the most economically vulnerable people in the industry. The people who most need access to financial infrastructure and who have the least leverage to demand it. So, where do we actually stand? The digital transformation of commercial sex has produced a landscape of genuine complexity. Some people are genuinely better off than they were before the internet. They have more autonomy, more safety, more economic control than previous generations in this industry had access to. Trafficking has been both enabled and exposed by digital platforms in ways that create new investigative opportunities. The debate about policy and law is more sophisticated and more evidence-based than it has ever been. And some things are worse. The FOSTA-SESTA experience demonstrated that hasty, ideologically driven legislation in this space can destroy safety infrastructure while doing nothing to address actual exploitation. The financial infrastructure's risk-averse approach to commercial sex creates a shadow regulatory system that is more punitive and less accountable than formal law. The global inequality that drives trafficking, the fundamental economic desperation that makes people vulnerable to deception and coercion, has not improved. Well, in our final episode of this series, my friends, we're going to look at all this together. The range of policy approaches being tried around the world, what the evidence says about their effects, and the hardest question this series has been building toward. What would it actually mean to take the human dignity of every person involved in this industry seriously? But of course, now before we finish this episode, I have a couple of discussion questions I want to share with you. My first question is, FOSTA-SESTA was passed with near unanimous congressional support and was opposed primarily by civil liberties and sex workers' rights groups whose voices had less political weight. What does this outcome tell us about whose interests democratic legislatures are most responsive to? My second question, OnlyFans and similar platforms represent more economic autonomy for some commercial sex workers and replicate existing inequalities for others. How should policy approach a technology that has these bifurcated effects? And my next question, major tech companies and financial infrastructure exercise de facto regulatory power over online commercial sex without formal mandate or accountability. Is this an acceptable substitute for formal regulation, or is it a problem? And my final question, the internet made it simultaneously easier to exploit people through digital deception and easier to investigate and document trafficking. How should anti-trafficking strategy adapt to this paradox? And with this, we come to the end of episode 9 of our series, A History of Sex as a Business. And next time, in our final episode of the series, we're going to talk about where we go from here. Laws, justice, and human dignity. You don't want to miss that. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. I'll see you again next time.